Hello viewers, here's something I'd like to ask you. If walls could talk, what stories do you think they'd tell about someone like Diddy? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Today, we're diving into a chilling glimpse of what's happening to him behind bars, and it's nothing short of terrifying. Chapter 1: A Stranger in the Shadows. When I first walked into the block, I thought I had already seen it all. I'd been around long enough to know the rhythm of prison life. Faces change, but the vibe stays the same. Hard stares, the constant low hum of voices, and the occasional burst of chaos. But when Diddy showed up, it was like the entire place shifted. I didn't know who he was at first. Not really. Sure, I'd heard the name, seen him on TV when I was out, but in here, celebrities lose their shine real quick. Yet with him, something was different. I remember the first time I saw him. He didn't come in with the usual bluster. No loud protests, no swagger. He moved quietly, almost like he was trying to shrink into the background, but it didn't work. His presence was loud in a different way. The guards stiffened when he walked past, their eyes following him longer than they followed anyone else. Inmates whispered, not loud enough for me to catch, but I could see the way they huddled together when he passed. Diddy didn't talk much. He kept his head down, his hands shoved into his pockets as though he wanted to disappear into himself. It wasn't fear, though. I've seen fear in here. It looks different. This was something else, something heavier. He carried himself like a man balancing too many secrets, and it made people uneasy. What really caught my attention, though, was the way the guards acted. You'd think they'd be eager to lord over someone like him, but it wasn't like that at all. They were cautious, not respectful exactly. This isn't that kind of place. But there was a carefulness in how they handled him, like they knew something the rest of us didn't. In the yard, Diddy was always by himself. He didn't play cards, didn't talk to anyone, didn't even look at the TV in the corner. He'd sit on the edge of the benches, facing the wall, his shoulders hunched forward. I couldn't figure out if he was trying to avoid attention or if he genuinely didn't know how to fit in. And trust me, fitting in here doesn't require much. But it was like he was allergic to human connection. And waiting at the front door, it was him climbing down, feet for toe, securing everything in place. His hands were burned by the cold daylight. He never looked anyone in the eye. Even when someone bumped into him, and it happened, though less than you'd think, he'd just mutter something under his breath and keep walking. I saw one guy try to start something with him, some loudmouth with more bark than bite, but Diddy didn't even flinch. He just stood there, staring past him like the guy didn't exist. It was almost more unnerving than if he'd fought back. By the second week, I started noticing more. Little things. The way his eyes darted around the room like he was mapping every exit. The way he always seemed to sit with his back against a wall. And then there was the pacing. Late at night when the block was quiet, I'd hear it. The soft shuffle of his shoes against the floor. Back and forth, like he was trying to walk off whatever demons were chewing at his heels. The muttering came later. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I'd hear this faint, almost whispery sound coming from his direction. But when I looked over, he'd be sitting still, staring at the wall. It wasn't until a few nights later that I caught him. It was one of those nights where sleep just wouldn't come. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, and the usual prison noises weren't enough to drown out my thoughts. That's when I heard it. His voice. Low and strained, like he was having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Urgent. Desperate, even. I sat up, straining to hear more. He was pacing again, his silhouette moving back and forth against the dim light coming from the hallway. His hands were clenched into fists, his head bowed like he was arguing with himself. Every now and then he'd stop, tilt his head as if listening, and then mutter something in response. It wasn't loud enough for anyone else to notice, not unless you were really paying attention. But I was. I couldn't look away. There was something raw in the way he moved, like a man fighting an invisible enemy. It wasn't fear or anger, not exactly. It was something deeper, something I didn't have a name for. I wanted to say something, maybe ask if he was okay, but the words stuck in my throat. What do you even say to someone like him? He wasn't like the rest of us. He didn't belong here, not really. But at the same time, he did. And that was the most unsettling part. The next morning, he was back to his usual self, or as close to usual as he ever got. Head down, quiet, keeping to himself. But I couldn't shake the image of him from the night before. It was like I'd seen a crack in the armor, a glimpse of whatever it was he was trying so hard to hide. And that's when it hit me. Maybe he wasn't hiding from us. Maybe he was hiding from something else, something only he could see. Chapter 2. The Meal No One Eats. There's a saying in here, you don't have to love the food, but you better eat it. In prison, meals are more than just food. They're a break from the monotony, a chance to sit with others, and maybe even swap stories or complaints. But for Diddy, the dining hall was anything but routine. It was another stage where his unraveling played out, one forkful at a time. I started noticing it a few days after the night I'd heard him muttering to himself. Breakfast trays came and went, but his barely looked touched. It wasn't just the typical prison complaints, everyone hates the food here. It was deeper than that. Diddy would stare at his plate like it was a test he wasn't sure he could pass. When he finally did pick up his fork, he'd poke at his eggs or scrape the surface of his oatmeal like he was inspecting it for something. Poison, a bug, I didn't know, but whatever he thought he'd find, it stopped him from eating. Lunch wasn't much different. He'd take the tray, shuffle to the corner of the hall where he always sat, and just sit there. Sometimes he'd pick at the bread or maybe take a sip of water, but the rest of it, untouched. The routine didn't go unnoticed. Inmates started whispering, again. The guy couldn't take 2 steps in here without someone commenting. This time, the whispers weren't just about his fame, they were about his shrinking frame. "Who's dropping weight like crazy?" one guy said as we stood in line for our trays. "You'd think a guy like him would try to keep some muscle, you know?" "Better he thinks the food's laced," another replied. "Paranoid as hell, dude's losing it." And they weren't wrong about the weight. The change was slow at first, like he was just skipping the occasional meal. But by the end of his first month, it was impossible to ignore. His face looked hollow, the sharpness of his cheekbones cutting through skin that seemed to hang loose. His shoulders, once broad, had started to slope, and his jumpsuit looked a size too big now. Whatever confidence he might have had when he walked in was gone, replaced by a frailty that didn't match the image the world had of him. It was hard to tell if this was all self-inflicted or if something deeper was at play. I started paying closer attention to the way he handled his meals. Every bite was a calculated move. He'd pick something up, examine it under the fluorescent lights, and sometimes sniff it before putting it back down. If he did eat, it was slow, deliberate, like he was bracing himself for something bad to happen. One day, I asked him why he wasn't eating. It was during lunch, and he was staring down at a pile of beans like they'd personally offended him. He didn't look up when he answered. "You ever wonder what they put in this stuff?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "What they're capable of?" I didn't know how to respond. I've heard my share of prison paranoia. Guys convinced the guards are bugging their cells, inmates thinking their lawyers are selling them out, but this was different. There was a weight in his voice that stuck with me. He didn't sound crazy. He sounded convinced. The paranoia wasn't confined to the dining hall either. Rumors started to spread about how he kept his commissary items locked away, even things like sealed snacks and bottled water. Some guys joked that he probably thought someone was sneaking in during the night to tamper with them. Others weren't so sure it was a joke. One afternoon, the tension boiled over. It was a regular day, as normal as it gets in here. People were sitting around, eating, talking. Diddy was in his usual spot, alone in the corner with his untouched tray in front of him. I wasn't paying him much attention at first, but then I heard his voice cut through the noise, sharp and accusing. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" he snapped, standing up so fast his chair screeched across the floor. The room went dead quiet. All eyes were on him as he pointed at one of the newer guys. Some kid who barely said 2 words since he got here. The guy looked confused, glancing around like he wasn't sure Diddy was even talking to him. "You're messing with my food," Diddy shouted, his voice cracking in a way that made everyone shift uncomfortably. "You think I don't see you? I see everything." The guards were on him in seconds, trying to calm him down before things got out of hand. The kid he was accusing didn't even defend himself. He just sat there, wide-eyed, as if he didn't know what planet he'd landed on. Diddy kept ranting as the guards escorted him out of the hall, his voice echoing off the walls. "You're all in on it," he yelled. "You think I don't know, but I know! I know!" When the doors slammed shut behind him, the room erupted into murmurs. Everyone had their theories. Some thought he was just losing his mind. Others said it was all an act. One guy swore he saw Diddy slip something into his own food the day before, like he was setting up a show. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that this wasn't normal. I've seen guys crack under pressure, but this felt different. It wasn't just paranoia. It was something deeper, something that had its claws in him and wasn't letting go. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if he was a victim of his own mind or a master manipulator playing a game none of us could see. As I sat there, staring at his untouched tray, a thought crept into my mind that I couldn't shake. Whatever was happening to him, whether it was real or staged, it was only the beginning. Chapter 3. Sleepless Nights, Paranoid Days. If the days with Diddy were strange, the nights were something else entirely. It started slowly at first, just the sound of his restless shifting, the occasional creak of the bunk as he adjusted his position. But over time, the silence of the block seemed to amplify his unease. While most of us tried to steal what little rest we could, Diddy seemed trapped in a battle with the darkness, his mind unable to shut down. The first time I noticed it, I chalked it up to nerves. Nobody sleeps easy in here during their first month. But this wasn't just trouble sleeping, it was something deeper. Night after night, I'd hear the shuffle of his feet, the subtle tap, tap, tap as he paced back and forth in his cell. Sometimes he'd stop, stand perfectly still for minutes on end, and then start up again. It was like watching a man wear a groove into his own sanity. Then came the window. There's not much to see from it. A slice of sky, maybe a distant light if you're lucky. But Diddy spent hours standing there, his hands gripping the bars so tight his knuckles turned white. He wasn't looking out at anything, he was just staring. It was the kind of stillness that made you uneasy, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. One night, I got up to use the toilet and found him in the same position, his silhouette illuminated by the faint hallway light. I leaned against the bars and watched him for a moment, half expecting him to turn and say something. But he didn't. He just stayed there, frozen, until I finally went back to bed. It wasn't long after that he started talking to me. Or rather, at me. It always happened late at night when the block was quiet and the guards' rounds were predictable. He'd lean against the wall closest to my cell, his voice low and rushed, like he was afraid someone might hear. "They're watching me," he whispered one night. I'd barely caught it, but the urgency in his tone pulled me out of my half-asleep haze. "Who?" I asked, keeping my voice just as low. "Them, the ones who put me here," he replied, his eyes darting around like he expected someone to pop out of the shadows. "You think this is about jail? It's bigger than that. They've got eyes everywhere." At first I thought he meant the guards. It wouldn't be the first time someone in here believed the COs were out to get them. But as he went on, it became clear that he wasn't just talking about the staff. "I hear them at night," he said another time. "Footsteps outside my cell. They're not guards though, too quiet. They're waiting for something. Waiting for me to mess up." I didn't know what to say. He sounded so sure, so convinced that he was being tracked, targeted, and yet there was no evidence, nothing I could see or hear to back it up. Still, the conviction in his voice made it hard to dismiss outright. His ramblings grew more frequent over the weeks, spilling out in fragmented thoughts and cryptic warnings. He talked about people he used to trust, people who turned on him when things got bad. He mentioned deals gone wrong, threats made in secret, promises that turned into betrayals. It was like he was piecing together a conspiracy in real time, his mind connecting dots that may or may not exist. But it wasn't just words. His paranoia seeped into everything he did. He flinched at sudden noises, avoided walking near certain cells, and refused to let the guards get too close. If someone so much as glanced in his direction, he'd stare them down like they were part of the them he kept talking about. And then, one night, it all came to a head. I'd just started to drift off when I heard the banging. At first, I thought it was one of those late-night scuffles that break out when tempers flare. But the sound was different, rhythmic, deliberate. I sat up and saw Diddy at his cell door, slamming his fists against the metal bars so hard it echoed through the block. "Let me out," he shouted, his voice raw and frantic. "I need to talk to the warden, now." The guards rushed in, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they tried to figure out what was going on. Diddy didn't back down. He kept yelling, his words tumbling out in a mix of anger and fear. "They're out there, I know they are," he screamed. "You think I'm blind? I hear them. I hear everything." One of the guards tried to calm him down, speaking in that low, controlled tone they use when things get out of hand. But Diddy wasn't having it. He grabbed the bars, his knuckles white, his face inches from the guards. "They're trying to kill me," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more chilling than his earlier shouts. "And you're letting them?" The guards eventually managed to get him back into his bunk, though it took more effort than I expected. For someone who'd looked so frail these past few weeks, he fought like a man possessed. When it was over, the block was silent again, but the tension lingered in the air like a bad smell. I stayed awake for hours after that, staring at the ceiling and replaying the scene in my head. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, just another inmate cracking under the pressure. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely wrong. Because the truth is, this place does things to people. It makes you question everything. What's real, what's in your head, who you can trust. And for someone like Diddy, someone who walked in with more baggage than most of us could carry, it's not hard to see how the lines might start to blur. As I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered in my mind. If Diddy was losing it, what did that mean for the rest of us? Chapter 4. The Health Spiral. By the time Diddy hit his 3rd month inside, he didn't look like the same man who'd arrived. His decline wasn't sudden. It crept in subtle at first, like a shadow growing longer as the day wore on. But now it was impossible to ignore. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, stretched thin over sharp cheekbones that hadn't been there before. His eyes were sunken, ringed with deep hollows that made him look perpetually exhausted. Even his movements, once deliberate and cautious, had slowed to the point where he shuffled more than he walked. I'd see him in the yard, sitting alone on the same bench as always, but now he looked like he was struggling to stay upright. His shoulders slumped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he cradled them in his lap. It wasn't just me who noticed. Whispers started circulating again, louder this time. Guys who'd written him off as untouchable were starting to change their tune. "You see him today," one inmate muttered during a card game. "He looks like he's one step away from keeling over." "He's playing it up," another chimed in, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Guys like him don't crack that easy. He's trying to set something up, mark my words." The theories flew fast and loose. Some thought he was manipulating the system, angling for an early release on medical grounds. Others believed the weight of his legal troubles, lawsuit after lawsuit piling up like bricks on his chest, was finally breaking him. A few even speculated that someone on the outside was orchestrating his downfall, poisoning him slowly to make sure he suffered. Me, I wasn't sure what to think. I'd seen Diddy up close, seen the way his hands shook when he reached for his water during meals, the way he winced like his entire body ached when he sat down. If it was an act, it was a damn convincing one. But if it wasn't, well, that was almost harder to wrap my head around. A guy like him, with all his money, his connections, his power, reduced to this? It didn't make sense. Maybe Cora had the key to what had happened to him with the brooch, and maybe she... The first time he was taken to the infirmary, it was mid-afternoon. I was in the block reading one of the beat-up paperbacks from the library cart when the guards showed up at his cell. They weren't rough with him like they usually were with the rest of us. Instead, they spoke in low tones, almost like they were trying not to startle him. He didn't resist, just stood up slowly, like every movement cost him, and let them lead him out. When he came back a few hours later, he didn't say a word. He just climbed onto his bunk, turned to face the wall, and stayed there for the rest of the night. The whispers started as soon as the cell doors locked. "Think he's really sick?" someone asked. "Man, please. That dude's got a team of lawyers working around the clock to get him out of here. This is just part of the play." But the trips to the infirmary didn't stop. Over the next couple of weeks, he was taken out at least 3 more times. Each time he came back looking worse than before. His face grew gaunter, his steps slower. By the 3rd visit, he needed help getting up the stairs to his cell. Even the guards seemed unsure of what to do with him. Normally they didn't hesitate to bark orders, but with Diddy, there was a hesitation, like they weren't sure how far they could push him without something breaking. It didn't take long for the rumors to reach a fever pitch. Some of the guys were convinced he was pulling a long con, trying to milk his condition for all it was worth. Others thought the stress of his crumbling empire was eating him alive from the inside out. And then there were those who whispered about darker forces, poison, curses, enemies with long memories and deeper pockets. One evening, while we were lined up for dinner, a guard let slip something that made my stomach drop. He asked for a medical release, the guard muttered to his partner, his voice low but not low enough. Said his condition's critical, warden's looking into it. The word spread through the block like wildfire. Medical release. It wasn't unheard of, but it was rare, and it usually required a damn good reason, something life-threatening. For a guy like Diddy, it would take more than a few trips to the infirmary to convince anyone. But if he really was as sick as he looked, it wasn't outside the realm of possibility. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd had with him since he got here. The paranoia, the muttering, the sleepless nights. They all made sense if you looked at them through the lens of a man falling apart. But there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Why would a guy like Diddy, someone who'd built his entire life on projecting strength and control, let himself fall apart so publicly? Why not fight harder to keep it together, to maintain the image that had carried him this far? Unless, of course, the falling apart was part of the plan. I glanced over at his cell. He was lying on his bunk, as still as a corpse, his back to the room. For all his talk of being watched, of being tracked and targeted, he seemed oblivious to the fact that every eye in the block was on him now. Whatever game he was playing, if it even was a game, it was working. But as I closed my eyes, one thought refused to leave me. If this was all an act, it was the best one I'd ever seen. And if it wasn't, well, that was even scarier. At some point, you start to see the cracks. It happens with everyone in here. No one can keep up an act forever. But with Diddy, it wasn't cracks in his story that caught my attention. It was the way he seemed to slip between 2 entirely different people. One moment, he was the frail, paranoid figure pacing his cell at night. The next, he was someone else entirely. Sharper, calculated, like a chess player seeing 3 moves ahead. It started small. There were times when I'd catch him watching the room instead of staring into space like he usually did. His eyes weren't just glancing, they were assessing. He'd watch how the guards moved, how the inmates interacted, as if he were collecting data. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Then there were his moments of clarity. One afternoon, I was sitting in the corner of the yard, reading a dog-eared book from the library, when I overheard him talking to another inmate. It was the first real conversation I'd heard him have since he got here. The other guy, a lifer known for running small-time cons, had made some offhand comment about his legal troubles, clearly fishing for a reaction. "You think you know what trouble looks like?" Diddy replied, his tone cutting but calm. "You're playing checkers, I'm playing chess." It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. There was no hint of the frantic paranoia that usually colored his voice. He sounded in control, confident even. It was a stark contrast to the man who'd been banging on his cell door just weeks before, screaming about being watched. But the moment that really got under my skin came during visitation. It wasn't often that I got to see him up close, but the visitation area offered a clearer view of the man behind the unraveling facade. I wasn't supposed to be paying attention. It's one of those unspoken rules in here. Don't stare at someone else's business. But that day, I couldn't help it. Diddy sat across from his lawyer, a man who looked as sharp as a knife in his tailored suit. At first, their conversation seemed tense. Diddy leaned forward, gesturing with his hands, his voice too low for me to hear. The lawyer nodded, taking notes, his expression unreadable. But as the minutes ticked by, something changed. Diddy leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxing, his tone shifted too. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm was different, calmer, measured. He wasn't pleading or ranting, he was planning. And the lawyer? He started to smile. Not a big smile, but one of those knowing smirks that said they were on the same page. Whatever Diddy was saying, it wasn't the ramblings of a man losing his grip, it was strategy. When their time was up, the lawyer stood, shook Diddy's hand, and left with the same cryptic smile. Diddy lingered for a moment, his gaze following the man out the door. And then, just as he turned to leave, I saw it, a flicker of something in his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, or triumph. Whatever it was, it didn't match the frail, paranoid image he'd been projecting for weeks. I didn't know what to make of it. Was this the real Diddy? The one who could turn a courtroom into his playground? Who could charm his way out of almost anything? Or was it just another layer of the act? Either way, it was clear that there was more going on than what he let us see. Back in the block, I started to notice more of these moments. They weren't frequent, just glimpses here and there, but they were enough to plant a seed of doubt. Like the time I caught him watching two inmates argue over a card game. He didn't intervene, didn't even look particularly interested, but there was a glint in his eye, a quiet amusement that didn't fit the narrative of a man too paranoid to function, or the way he managed to avoid trouble without ever looking like he was avoiding it. And here, everyone has a role to play. Some guys fight, some talk their way out of things, and some just keep their heads down. Diddy, though, seemed to operate on a different level. He didn't engage, didn't provoke, but somehow, he always ended up exactly where he needed to be. It was as if he had the whole place mapped out in his head. Every move calculated in advance. The more I watched, the more I began to question everything. Was his paranoia real? Or was it a smokescreen, a way to keep us and maybe even the guards off balance? Was his frailty a symptom of genuine stress, or was it part of a bigger plan? The line between reality and performance was so thin, it was almost impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The moment that cemented my doubts came late one night. I was lying in my bunk, half asleep, when I heard a faint sound coming from his cell. At first, I thought it was the usual pacing, but when I listened closer, I realized it wasn't footsteps. It was his voice, low and steady, almost like a chant. He was muttering something, but not in the frantic, disjointed way I'd heard before. This was different, calm, deliberate, like he was rehearsing a speech. The next morning, he was back to his usual self. Quiet, withdrawn, a shadow of the man he used to be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the version of him I'd seen during visitation, the one who'd had his lawyer smiling like they'd just cracked the code, was still in there somewhere. As I lay in my bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, one question kept running through my mind. Was Diddy truly unraveling, or was this all part of a meticulously planned strategy? And if it was a strategy, what was the end game? Chapter 6. The Media Circus. The media always finds a way to seep through prison walls. It doesn't matter how disconnected this place feels from the outside world. Big stories have a way of landing here like a bomb, leaving everyone scrambling to catch the pieces. And Diddy? Well, he wasn't just any story. By the time word got out about his so-called condition, it was like someone had lit a match in a room full of gas. It started with whispers, like everything else in here. Someone overheard a guard talking about a news segment. A few hours later, an inmate with a radio confirmed it. Reports were coming in about Diddy's deteriorating health. Words like emaciated, mentally unstable, and unjust treatment were being thrown around, painting a picture of a man barely holding on. And just like that, the whole block was buzzing. There are half a dozen police officers in this building, but one of them. You hear about Diddy? One guy asked me during lunch. They're saying he's wasting away in here, like the prison's killing him. I didn't say anything, just nodded and kept eating, but my mind was racing. Was it true? Was he really that bad off? Or was this something else? A narrative spun by the people on the outside? If I'd learned anything from watching Diddy over the past few weeks, it was that nothing about him was ever as simple as it seemed. The reaction from the guards was almost immediate. They weren't exactly known for their compassion, but suddenly it was like they were walking on eggshells around him. More health checks, more visits from the infirmary staff. They even started bringing his meals straight to his cell instead of making him eat in the dining hall. At first, it seemed like they were genuinely concerned, but the more I watched, the clearer it became. This wasn't about Diddy, it was about them. The prison system doesn't like bad press. The second a story like this hits the airwaves, everyone scrambles to cover their asses. Warden doesn't want to be the one blamed for mistreating a high-profile inmate. Guards don't want to be accused of negligence or worse. And so Diddy became a project, a liability to be managed. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, taking mental notes like I always did. The guards who used to bark orders at him were now speaking softer, their voices laced with forced patience. The infirmary staff started showing up with clipboards, jotting down notes like they were preparing for an inspection. Even the warden made an appearance one afternoon, standing outside Diddy's cell with his arms crossed, nodding along to whatever the head nurse was saying. Meanwhile, Diddy just played his part. He didn't say much, but he didn't need to. The frailty spoke for itself, his sunken eyes, the way his hands trembled when he reached for his water. He'd become the perfect image of a man beaten down by the system, and whether it was real or not didn't seem to matter. The world outside was buying it. The other inmates weren't so convinced. Rumors started flying, each one wilder than the last. Some said his team was behind the leaks, feeding the media stories to build a case for early release. Others thought it was all an elaborate con, a long game designed to keep everyone, guards, lawyers, reporters, off balance. And then there were those who believed he really was falling apart, that the weight of his past had finally caught up to him. Man's got the whole world feeling sorry for him, one guy muttered as we walked back from the yard. Meanwhile, he's probably laughing his ass off in there, counting down the days till he's out. But was he? I wasn't so sure. There were moments when I'd catch him in his cell, staring at the wall like he was miles away. Other times he'd be pacing again, muttering under his breath, his movements jerky and frantic. If it was an act, it was a damn convincing one. But if it wasn't, well, that opened up a whole different set of questions. The media frenzy only grew as the days went on. Headlines screamed about humane conditions and the decline of an icon. Talk shows debated whether he was being mistreated or if he was just another celebrity expecting special treatment. Some commentators called for investigations into the prison system, while others accused Diddy of faking it for sympathy. It was a circus, and the center ring was right here in our block. I overheard one of the guards talking to another during their rounds, his voice low but urgent. "They're saying he needs a full medical evaluation," he said. "His lawyer's pushing for a transfer, claims his condition's critical." "Think they'll go for it?" the other guard asked. "Hell if I know," the first one replied. "But if they don't, and something happens to him in here, it's our necks on the line." I didn't know what to think anymore. Was Diddy really on the verge of collapse, or was this all part of some master plan? Every time I thought I'd figured him out, he'd do something to throw me off, like the time I caught him smiling, just a faint, fleeting grin as he sat on his bunk staring at the floor. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it left me wondering, was it relief, satisfaction, or was it just my imagination? By the end of the week, the block was quieter than usual. The guards were tense, the inmates were restless, and Diddy just kept on being Diddy. Frail one moment, calculated the next. A man who seemed to exist in two realities at once. And me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all being played. By him, by the system, by the media, maybe by all three. Whatever was happening, one thing was clear. Diddy wasn't just surviving in here. He was controlling the narrative, whether anyone realized it or not. Chapter 7. A Truth Revealed. It's funny how the truth has a way of sneaking up on you. In a place like this, it's usually buried deep, tangled in layers of lies and half-truths. But sometimes, if you're paying close enough attention, it shows up when you least expect it. That's how I found the letter. A small piece of paper that, for all its simplicity, changed everything I thought I knew about Diddy. It happened one evening while I was sweeping the block, one of those mind-numbing chores that make the hours crawl by. The guards weren't paying much attention, their eyes glued to some game on the tiny TV in their station. Most of the other inmates were in their cells, either asleep or pretending to be. As I passed by Diddy's cell, I noticed something unusual. A folded piece of paper tucked just under the edge of his mattress. Now, at first I wasn't sure what to do. Taking something from another inmate's cell, even something as small as a piece of paper, is a risk. If you get caught, the fallout can be brutal. But curiosity got the better of me. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then reached in and grabbed it. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, and the words were carefully chosen. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs, but it was enough. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but the tone made it clear it wasn't meant for just anyone to read. It spoke about public perception and narrative control, phrases that sounded more like they belonged in a PR meeting than in a prison cell. There were specific instructions, too, mentions of how his frailty should be emphasized, how the media should be fed carefully curated stories about his condition. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. It wasn't just what the letter said, it was what it implied. All this time I'd been watching Diddy fall apart, wondering if it was real or if it was an act. And here, in black and white, was the answer. It was both. The frailty, the paranoia, the weight loss. It wasn't all fake, but it wasn't entirely genuine either. It was a strategy, a calculated move in a game I hadn't even realized I was a part of. For the rest of the night, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Should I turn it in, show it to the guards? The thought crossed my mind more than once, but something held me back. Maybe it was the knowledge that exposing it wouldn't change anything, or maybe it was the fear that Diddy would find out, and the consequences would be far worse than I could imagine. Either way, I kept it to myself, tucking it away in the lining of my mattress where no one else would find it. In the days that followed, I watched Diddy more closely than ever. He was still deteriorating, or at least he seemed to be. His movements were sluggish, his voice softer, his presence a shadow of what it once was. But every now and then there'd be a flicker of something else, a moment of clarity that didn't fit the narrative. Like the time I saw him catch a guard's eye and nod ever so slightly, a gesture so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention, or the way he handled himself during a routine inspection, answering the guards' questions with a calm confidence that didn't match his frail demeanor. It was like watching two different people inhabit the same body. One moment, he was the broken man the world believed him to be. The next, he was something else entirely. Someone in control, pulling strings no one else could see. I kept the letter hidden, but it burned a hole in my thoughts. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but every time I worked up the nerve, I stopped myself. What if I was wrong? What if this was all in my head? And even if I wasn't, what good would it do? Diddy wasn't the kind of man who gave away his secrets easily. But then came the night I couldn't hold back any longer. It was late, the block quiet except for the occasional snore or shuffle of feet. I approached his cell, my heart pounding in my chest. He was sitting on his bunk, his back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. "I found the letter," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't move, didn't even look at me. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. But then he spoke, his voice low and even. "You put letter? The one under your mattress," I said. "The one about controlling the narrative, about making sure the media sees you a certain way." That got his attention. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no anger in his gaze, no panic, just curiosity, like he was trying to figure out how much I really knew. "And what do you think it means?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I think you're not as broken as you want people to believe," I said finally. "I think you're playing a game and the rest of us are just pieces on the board." For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then he smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that sent a chill down my spine. "Maybe I am," he said. "Or maybe you're just seeing what you want to see." He lay back down, turning away from me, the conversation clearly over. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of his words, but they only left me with more questions. As I walked back to my cell, the letter tucked safely in its hiding spot, one thought kept running through my mind. Was Diddy unraveling, or was he orchestrating the most elaborate performance of his life? The truth, I realized, might be something I'd never fully understand. Chapter 8, The Great Escape Plan? The rumors started as a trickle, but by the end of the week, they were impossible to ignore. Word was, Diddy's team had filed a motion for medical release, citing critical health concerns. The whispers spread through the block like wildfire, each inmate adding their own spin to the story. Some said he was angling for a hospital transfer. Others claimed he was going to walk free altogether. No one knew the truth, but one thing was clear. Something was about to happen. By this point, I'd stopped trying to separate fact from fiction when it came to Diddy. Everything about him was a question mark, every moment laced with ambiguity. But as the tension in the air grew thicker, I couldn't help but feel like we were nearing the end game, whatever that might look like. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a regular afternoon, or at least it started that way. I was sitting at my usual spot in the yard, keeping my head down when I saw him. Diddy was walking back from the infirmary, his movements slow and deliberate, his frame even thinner than it had been a week ago. But something about him caught my eye. Maybe it was the way he held his head a little higher, or the faint glint in his eye that hadn't been there before. Whatever it was, it didn't fit the image of a man on the verge of collapse. I watched as he passed a group of inmates huddled near the fence, their conversation halting as he walked by. He didn't acknowledge them, didn't say a word, but the way they stiffened told me everything I needed to know. Diddy wasn't just a man in decline, he was still a force to be reckoned with, even in his current state. Later that day, I saw it again. We were lined up for dinner when one of the guards barked at an inmate for holding up the line. Most of us barely noticed. It was the kind of thing that happened all the time. But Diddy? He didn't flinch, didn't even turn his head. Instead, I caught the faintest hint of a smile, so fleeting I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it was there, and it sent a chill down my spine. That's when I realized the man was playing a game and we were all pawns. His frailty, his paranoia, even his breakdowns. They were pieces on a chessboard, moves calculated to perfection. And now, with the rumors of his medical release swirling, it was clear that the endgame was in sight. The climax came that night. I was lying on my bunk staring at the ceiling when the alarm went off. The sound was deafening, echoing through the block as guards scrambled to respond. I sat up, trying to make sense of the chaos, when I heard it, shouts coming from Diddy's cell. By the time I made it to the bars, the scene was already unfolding. Diddy was lying on the floor of his cell, his body limp, his breathing shallow. A guard was yelling into his radio, calling for medical assistance, while another tried to rouse him. Inmates crowded around their cell doors, craning their necks to get a better look. Within minutes, the medical team arrived, pushing a stretcher through the block as the guards barked orders to clear the way. I watched as they loaded him onto the stretcher, his body limp and lifeless. For a moment, I almost believed it, believed that he was truly at the end of his rope. But then, as they wheeled him past my cell, I saw it. A smirk. He was faint, barely there, but it was enough. Diddy's lips curled ever so slightly, the kind of expression that spoke volumes without saying a word. It was the look of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, a man who was still in control even as the world around him believed he wasn't. The block was buzzing for hours after he was taken away. Speculation ran wild. Some said he'd fake the whole thing, others swore he was on his deathbed. The guards didn't say much, their faces tight with the kind of tension that only comes from knowing you're under a microscope. As for me, I didn't know what to believe anymore. The next morning, the news hit. Reports flooded in about Diddy's medical emergency, complete with dramatic headlines and grainy photos of him being wheeled out on the stretcher. Commentators debated whether the prison had pushed him too far, whether his condition had been ignored until it was too late. Public outcry reached a fever pitch, with activists and celebrities demanding answers. But as I sat in my cell, listening to the radio broadcasts and the murmurs of my fellow inmates, I couldn't shake the image of that smirk. It was burned into my mind, a reminder that nothing about Diddy was ever as it seemed. Was he truly on the verge of collapse, or had he orchestrated the entire spectacle to manipulate the system and the media? I didn't know, and maybe that was the point. Diddy had always been a master of reinvention, a man who thrived on controlling the narrative. And here he'd done it again, turning his own frailty into a weapon, his own downfall into a story the world couldn't look away from. As the days passed and the rumors continued to swirl, one thing became clear: whether he was faking it or not, Diddy had won. He'd managed to take control in a place designed to strip it away, to turn his vulnerability into power. And for the rest of us, all we could do was watch, caught in the wake of a game we never even realized we were playing.